Welcome to our plenary session, Untethered Journalism, the role for independent media. My name is Ron Elving. I am Senior Washington Editor for NPR News. I also would like to welcome our web audience and want to let you know that we will be taking your questions via Twitter using #GPF2012, 2012. You all know that we live in an increasingly connected world where NGOs, philanthropists, and private sector actors are increasingly providing the services that were previously in the purview of government alone. And as the social contract continues to evolve, we are learning how to allocate those responsibilities across sectors, taking advantage of the unique strengths of each to strengthen a still developing system of global governance. And in this session, we turn to the media and to the role the media can play and must play in holding each of us accountable to our commitments under that new social contract. With me, joining me for this important conversation, are three distinguished panelists. And I'm going to begin here in the middle with Amadou Bahtar, who is the Chief Executive of the African Media Initiative, an unprecedented Pan-African effort aimed at providing the contents or the continent's media owners and practitioners with the tools they need to play an effective role in their societies. He is also known as the co-founder and chairman of the All Africa Global Media, an international multimedia content service provider, systems technology developer, and the largest distributor of African news and information worldwide. At the end of the panel, we see Tom Porteous. He is the Deputy Program Director at Human Rights Watch. He joined Human Rights Watch in 2006 as the London Director responsible for communications and advocacy in the United Kingdom. In the 1980s and early 1990s, he was a freelance correspondent for The Guardian newspaper, the BBC, other media, first in Cairo and later in Berlin, Algeria, and Morocco. And Hunter Walk, closest to me here in the middle, is a director of product management at YouTube, where he focuses on YouTube as a platform for social good, activism, and free expression. He views YouTube's relationship with the first of those responsibilities, good, as supporting three main pillars: causes and nonprofits, education, and finally activism and free expression. And he hopes to foster this further with his new role. Now, I'd also like to acknowledge the presence with us of a scintillating personality whom you're going to hear more from tomorrow night, and he is Dr. Bassem Youssef. He is sometimes referred to, stand up please, so we can all, there we go. And he is going to be speaking tomorrow night, and some of you may have already heard of him. He is sometimes referred to as the Jon Stewart of Egypt. He has made much in both serious and in light fashion of the events of the recent years and recent months in Cairo, took matters into his own hands, as it were, after the events of Tahrir Square, and he began with a YouTube mock news broadcast, now known as the Bassem Youssef Show on Egyptian TV. We're looking forward to learning more about how he has combined various media and satire to convey fundamental truths about events in Egypt, something that has sometimes been practiced in this country as well. So to begin our discussion, which will precede taking questions from the audience and also from Twitter, I'd like to begin by directing one question to all three of our panelists and getting each of them to respond to it. I'm going to start immediately with you, Hunter, but what do we mean by untethered journalism? That term untethered can mean released, it can mean liberated, unleashed, but untethered can also mean without any restraint or without any reference point. Mm-hmm. So which of those two, if you will, extremes comes to your mind when you hear untethered journalism?
That's a great question. So I think YouTube inherently is a platform that goes to the heart of untethering, and it untethers from, I guess, traditional restrictions on who gets to create and who gets to watch. And so I actually, rather than choose, I think it's a mixture of both of those because they're maybe different sides of the same coin. The explosion in the ability for people to create video, YouTube gets more than 60 hours of content uploaded every minute, really leads to, I think, an abundance that before bandwidth was scarce. There was only so many blue lines on your TV program guide, so somebody had to decide what went there. And what we're really seeing with YouTube is that the audience gets to decide and creators get to decide. So I think it's untethered from the scarcity and traditional cost model of production. On the other side, what we really see is the first, I'd say, global citizenship, global media citizen. 70% of YouTube's traffic comes from outside the US, and every video thus ends up with a worldwide audience. And so for the ability to watch things simultaneous and together and comment and interact is a much more engaged citizenship than maybe somebody who experiences video just locally or is more passive, has to sit back and watch, but doesn't have the ability to respond. And so for us, I think untethering is about abundance and global aspect of new media.
And an extraordinary expression of how different things are from just a very few years ago, let alone a generation or two. Amadou, from your perspective.
Well, thank you for that question. Good afternoon, everyone. Actually, I must confess I have no idea. I simply don't know. What I know, though, for a fact is, our societies, and particularly where I'm coming from, African societies have evolved to a point where everybody has a voice. And everybody having a voice, enlarges a little bit, the space, the traditional space which has been controlled by governments for, forever. And by doing that, basically clamping down on all citizens' rights, but also ambitions towards holding them to account and demanding transparency and accountability. So I think what this would mean in this context is basically coming at an age where everybody now has a voice, and that can be related to journalism, which actually is a good thing, but also at the same time puts huge challenges on the profession at large.
It does. And Tom, I can't resist asking you if you can give us some thoughts on this subject, both as in your current role with Human Rights Watch, as an advocate, and also from your perspective as a journalist.
Well, thank you, actually. That's just what I was going to do. But good afternoon, everyone. And attentive readers of the program might have expected to see Ken Roth, my boss here. I'm obviously not Ken Roth, but I jumped in at the last minute, and he apologizes for his absence. I actually wanted to spend the weekend reading a bit about freedom of expression and so forth, but I actually ended up spending half my weekend trying to get two of my colleagues out of detention in Bahrain because they were arrested last night yesterday morning, in fact, in the U.S. time, at a demonstration outside of Manama in Bahrain. A good example of the efforts of autocratic regimes in the Middle East to keep journalism and freedom of expression as tethered as possible. But to answer your question in the way that you suggest, as a former journalist, I believe very much in responsible journalism, whatever that is, but I think you can imagine. But as a human rights advocate, I also will defend the right of journalists to be totally irresponsible, as long as they don't actually go as far as inciting violence, and then I think that's where their right to freedom of expression ends, if you like. So I think that in a nutshell, that's the answer. I defend responsible journalism. I believe journalists have a responsibility to tell the truth, to be rigorous in their research, to do all the things that I was trained to do as a journalist with the BBC and The Guardian. But at the same time, I do believe in the importance of freedom of expression. I believe that we should respect the rights of people to be unrestrained in what they say within the limits that I've described.
Gentlemen, let me throw this one out and let any of you answer it as you see fit. Do you think that in some sense or another, the rules, as we may have understood them in conventional journalism, traditional legacy forms of journalism, newspapers, broadcast, now the various cable outlets and so on, all moving on into the internet with the websites. Do you think that the rules that have traditionally applied to journalism are applicable, make sense, have a role to play when you're talking about the kind of independent media that, for example, YouTube represents, or any of the many social media represent?
From my perspective at YouTube, yes, of course. And we see that in multiple layers. The first is what we might think of as traditional journalists or traditional news agencies using YouTube as another broadcast platform. So in that case, it's taking exactly the type of content they've already been creating, or because of the distribution model, actually able to expand their reach. But even more interesting, I think what we see is journalists playing two new roles that were a little bit different than when you think about the reporter with their flip book going out and getting the primary material. And that's context and curation. And so the world is being documented. The world is being documented because everyone has a camera in their pocket. And as a reporter, what we see are YouTube being not just an endpoint for content they create, but a starting point. It's the place they find stories. It's the place that they take content that's coming up and often lacks context. We might get around the Arab Spring, tremendous number of videos came through without much description, because it was all they could do to get it out, get it uploaded, get it on an SD card. And organizations like Storyful, which is comprised of ex-journalists, would curate the content, would add some context, would be able to, in the event that a video came in and wasn't what it purported to be, they had enough information to point out, well, that building was taken down 10 years ago, so this isn't probably new. And that's a very, very important role. That's a layer that I think sits on top of everyone having a voice. And it doesn't mean that the individual uploader doesn't have all the same morality or ethics of journalism, but context is what sometimes can turn a 3-minute video into a movement, into a story.
Well, I think that what we've seen over the past few years everywhere around the world is the way we collect, disseminate, and consume news and information has changed radically, completely. But there's one thing which remains fundamental. I mean, the fundamental principle which remains is the critical importance of media in strengthening societies and actually in helping uplift societies. And if you analyze a little bit what happened in North Africa, what you've called Arab Spring, is both the vulnerability of autocratic regimes and their not only vulnerability but also their total weakness. But at the same time, it showed the fact that when people can have some channels, and those channels can reach people in the country and around the world, then you see the true manifestation of the importance of media. No matter, the regulations which exist around the media landscape. So I think, despite all the changes which we're witnessing now, it is important that journalists keep on the ball, watching and reporting. Now, just a little bit of a comment on what my friend here just said is, yes, defending the right of journalists being irresponsible. Now, I come from a space where I hear that every day, but I hear that not from the right guys or the right ladies. I hear that from, the bad guys. Basically, we have studies around the continent which show you have 3 socio-professional categories which are the least trustworthy. And they're in order. One is the police, the politicians, and journalists. So whenever you talk to, politicians, they always tell you, well, these guys are irresponsible. And, they put some facts to your face. So based on that, we actually have decided to do something against that. And I'll come back to that a little bit later.
Tom?
Well, when you talk about traditional media or traditional journalism, I assume you're talking about the traditional media in the Western sense, but there's also the sort of the other kind of traditional media, which is the traditional media of the autocratic dictatorship. When I was in Berlin at the end of the 1980s, I remember sitting in the living room of a friend of mine in East Berlin, and he had in his living room a pile of the daily newspaper of the Communist Party, which is called Neues Deutschland. And he said, you see that pile of newspapers there? It is against the law for me to have that pile of newspapers there, because the official discourse, the official media was so contradictory from one day to another or from one month to another. The discourse would change and it would be contradictory. And so it was subversive to actually have an archive of the official communist newspaper. That's the kind of journalism that Human Rights Watch struggles against the whole time, this kind of control of information by autocratic regimes. I would say that what's going on now with the media, with these amazing changes in information technology, is a challenge both to the traditional media in the sense that I think you meant, but also the traditional media in autocratic regimes. And we've seen that very clearly in the immense impact of social media in the Middle East and North Africa in the last year. It's been an incredible experience to see how young activists have been able to use social media, have been able to use video, multimedia, YouTube, and so forth, in order to challenge decades of ruthless dictatorship. The other thing that's changing, of course, is the economy of the media as a result of the information revolution. Such that I think most of the newspapers and broadcasters are finding it very struggling, frankly, to find a model where, with the advent of the internet and such choice that presents consumers with, how can they actually make money out of what they do, unless they are sort of funded by the government like the BBC or NPR to some extent. So. I think that's a real challenge, and it's something that affects Human Rights Watch and organizations like Human Rights Watch very directly, because we are finding that in our work of doing what is essentially investigative journalism with an advocacy edge, in other words, going to a country and doing an in-depth investigation into some sort of human rights crisis or issue, we're finding that we're increasingly alone, that the journalists we used to find in those kinds of situations are not there because their organizations don't have the money that they used to have to do that kind of thing, which is something that we take very seriously. It's an opportunity for us because obviously we are then the only provider of that news, and that means that the media is coming increasingly to us for the information that we're able to provide with our own funding model, which is obviously different and relies on philanthropy. So that's one area which clearly affects Human Rights Watch and other NGOs, in which the changes in the media are having quite a big impact.
Yes, Hunter.
The question that Tom brought up of audience in this world, where does audience move, is a very interesting one, and we have great data on that. When I was doing my 2011 year in review, I was looking for interesting stats, and I happened upon one that totally shocked me, but when I started to think about it and talk to some folks, made sense. And I was looking at per capita, at each country, per capita internet user, who watches the most YouTube? So of the folks that are online within a country, how much YouTube they watch. And the US, that's a big market for us. Brazil, UK, all these countries that are quite sizable in terms of the audience. I mean, the creators on YouTube are almost the equivalent of cable channels in the amount of audience. They get millions of people. But what surprised me was the answer, by far, was Saudi Arabia. So in Saudi Arabia, internet users watch 3 times as much YouTube on average than US internet users. And why? Well, because when you're all of a sudden given choice, when you're all of a sudden given abundance, when you're untethered from what was previously a small set of media options, and you're able to see and experience at both a hyper-local, what goes on around you, as well as a global level, what do people care about, it turns out that people vote with their feet and vote with their attention and add to, or sometimes shift away from, the traditional media sources they've relied upon.
I had no idea there were that many office workers in Saudi Arabia. But I guess now we have an indication that that's the case.
This might be more important than the GDP in terms of charting growth.
Well, surely we can all agree that the use of the social media that we saw in terms of some of the regimes that were overthrown in recent years was a positive thing that was inspiring to the world, and that we all saw as people rising up and finding their voice, and then finding these extraordinary electronic tools connected to these extraordinary global networks that enabled people to have instant attention to problems that otherwise had festered for decades and generations. But just pausing for a moment, as we look at some of the other things that the traditional media have done, one of the things that they have done is provide a certain kind of attention to problems that were addressed by philanthropy, including global philanthropy. And to some degree, the community has come to understand how to use those media, how to communicate through those media. And if those media are going to be substantially weakened or altered or led toward some form of transformation, if not extinction, how exactly does the global philanthropy community make use of this new, much more diffuse energy and these much more widely distributed tools to call attention to the causes that are the causes of global philanthropy?
Well, look, I think actually the global philanthropy community would really benefit a lot from these new forms of media, because let's keep in mind that in the traditional model, we still had a gatekeeper, right? Mm-hmm. And because of that gatekeeper role which was there, a lot of things were filtered. Today, it's actually the citizens which by themselves engaged, with whoever they want. Philanthropy community, for instance. So I think actually if I was working in this field, what I will do is all my communication resources, I'll put a lot of it in, new media. Not meaning that, we sideline, traditional media, because traditional media keeps still doing excellent work, particularly in some areas like, in Africa, where, radio still is the dominant by far. The dominant means, if you want to reach citizens. So that's my take on that.
Tom, thoughts?
Yes. I think that the traditional media still plays a very important role. Human Rights Watch's theory of change is actually quite simple. We go and we do our human rights research, whether on a crisis in Syria or something more long-running in Africa, connection between human rights abuses and development in Ethiopia, just to give a recent example. And then we try to use that information in order to persuade people who have the power and influence in a particular situation to do something about it. And obviously the media is an incredibly important part of that advocacy effort. We still obviously use the traditional media because the traditional media is still very, very powerful. But the new media presents us with all kinds of opportunities, which I hope that we're grasping. A number of my colleagues now, are regular Twitterers, and have some quite large followings in their own communities. I mean, I believe one of our biggest Twitterers is our Pakistan researcher who has a huge following in Pakistan, and actually it's a good way for him to sort of do some of his advocacy on Twitter, literally. So I think that we still haven't really kind of grasped the enormity of the kind of opportunities that are presented. But let's not forget that there are also challenges in this new media. The new media is just as much a tool available for the bad guys as it is for the good guys. So, you know, after the failure of the first uprising, if you like, in the Middle East, which was in Iran in 2009, you know, everyone was talking at that time about, you know, the power of social media and stuff, and it failed. The uprising was completely stamped out by the regime, and since then, the Iranian regime has moved to deal with the threat by basically closing down the media, the internet in Iran, and they're proceeding with that quite swiftly. So, and of course, you know, also one should not forget that the Arab Spring is in a process of, you know, I mean, there are some places that are doing better than others, but even where it's doing best, say in Tunisia, there is a transition underway. And there is a transition, the end of which is still not clear. And in the last few weeks, we've actually issued a number of press releases criticizing the authorities in Tunisia for example, handing down 7-year prison sentences to 2 writers for remarks that were deemed offensive to Islam, using repressive legislation from the era of the previous regime. So one of the recommendations that we're making in all these transitions, whether in Tunisia or in Libya or in Egypt, is that one of the priorities should be to repeal this kind of repressive legislation and to bring in legislation which is in compliance with international treaties which many of these states have actually signed up to already. So there are huge challenges. And I think that you know, it's the role of human rights organizations to continue to be extremely vigilant, particularly when it comes to freedom of expression in the new transitioning states of the Middle East and North Africa.
So big question, how do organizations that are doing good make use of all this technology? I have a very specific answer. Find me after the panel, or if you're watching, you can email me, Hunter@Google. I think at YouTube, we have a program that's specifically aimed at working with nonprofits, and launched a few years ago. It's now operating in 4 countries with 17,000 nonprofits, hundreds of whom have more than 1 million views of video. So it's people really creating a presence, not just claiming you know, a small namespace and talking to themselves. And one of the priorities for me is figuring out how to work effectively through foundations, because there's actually a lot of capacity building that needs to be done in terms of helping the downstream organizations tell their story. Video is where, you know, 15 years ago you'd say, you guys, I know you're busy, I know you're understaffed, but you really need a website. And then 5, 10 years ago it'd be, guys, you got to figure out how to let donors give you money online. And now it's, how are you going to use video? And not just, you know, we're at the level where, and when I talk to a lot of NGOs, and I ask them what their goals are with video, it's often fuzzy. It's awareness. I want awareness. And that's great. That's a first step. That means a lot about, you know, I want to be heard. I want to understand who is watching me. But I want to get to the point where we are as analytical as the media company and advertising community is. That they know if they get 1,000 views of a video, they'll get a check for $25 in terms of advertising. I want people to know that 1,000 views of a video turns into $50 of donations, or 200 clicks to a petition, or 250 people registering for an email list wanting to know more, becoming active. But that's not going to happen without the help of folks in this room. So I hope to continue the dialogue, but I think what we really need are people who want to get out ahead of this and start figuring out, well, how do we get our organizations using this? How do we make sure that they have funding for it, right? So again, this gets into the dirty area of, oh, well, that's not spending on direct programs, that's spending on, those are operational costs, and of course, all good organizations want to minimize operational cost and put all the money towards program spending. But when you see the leverage that people can get out of understanding media, one of the most effective nonprofits on YouTube told me that they've been using social media so well that actually they've gotten their cost to raise $1 down to 7 cents. And so when I hear that, I say, well, you know, how can we get you, how can we get you more money? How can we get this story spread, and so that, you know, everybody can tell that, you know, there's great content in this room and through the organizations you support, and it's really a shame if that content's not coming online, because what I can tell you is people want to watch it.
Thank you, Hunter. I heard a murmur pass through the room when you said 7 cents to the dollar. I think this is highly useful information. And it also provides an excellent segue for us to begin to take your questions and also take questions from those of us following us via Twitter. Let me say again that if you're using Twitter, you can follow us at hashtag GPF2012. And for those of you in the room, please just raise your hand. I will point to you. We will bring a microphone to you. We're going to lower the lights here, I think, just a little bit to make it easier for you. And when you do get a microphone, please let us know which of the panelists you are addressing your question to, and please try to be concise in your question and comments, and that way we can have as many questions from as many participants as possible. And we'll begin over here. I believe I saw the first hand over here.
Hello, my name is Laureen Arbus, and I wanted to go for a minute from untethered journalism to untethered philanthropism, and just a very quick anecdote. Basically, philanthropy in this country was revolutionized by, and ultimately hundreds of millions of dollars were raised when in virtually every home in America, the telethon arrived. And my mother created the format for and implemented the first telethon in this country. And my question is to you, Hunter, and I love what you've said and what you're doing, which I'm very familiar with. It's fantastic. But with 60,000 uptakes a minute, is there any way that you can, and maybe you haven't, I've just not caught on to it, attach to your own volume business the messaging of philanthropy as a concept?
Yes, so absolutely. When we launched our nonprofit program, what it was aimed at was giving 501c3s, NGOs, cause-based institutions, not just the ability to get view counts, but the ability to get dollars. And so whether it be linking to their own donation workflows or actually using Google's own tools on site, it gives them the specific ability to add a donate button to a video. What I think the next wave will be, and what we haven't done yet, but I believe has great potential, is not just for causes to speak on their behalf, but for then their community to pull that through and amplify. YouTube is 850 million people worldwide every month, but it's not 850 million individual points, right? It's hubs and spokes. And so what I think would really continue to unlock the philanthropy is first we get the causes on the platform, we give them a voice. They build their community, and then that voice spreads it. And spreads it in a way where, again, awareness is great, but you know that there's dollars backing that up. To the point of the telethon, actually, we've only succeeded when we have followed our community, when we listen to them and figure stuff out. This past December, for I believe it was the 4th year in a row, a bunch of the most notable YouTube creators, sort of the individual folks, the individual personalities who came up, as opposed to as opposed to the Lady Gagas of the world, held what they call the Project for Awesome. And the Project for Awesome actually is a telethon where they have raised now upwards of 6 figures for the causes that each of them care about. And so what I think we're seeing is that this next generation of content creator sees cause affiliation as 2 things. One, brand building, audience development. I think there is something aspect of, well, let me talk about something emotional that my audience cares about, but also very, very personal. And a way to almost practice their skill to be effective. They always had the opportunity to write a $50 check. But if they can make a video and raise $5,000 for the organization, then that's a multiplier effect that we're just seeing the beginning of. YouTube is less than 7 years old. And so when I look ahead for what the next decade of the intersection of video and philanthropy, I very much see learning from television, but evolving beyond it because the direct response is right there. You don't even have to pick up the phone. You click. And then that click gets amplified because it gets shared.
I'm going to take a question here from Twitter. The Twitter question is, the roles of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube in the Arab awakening are clear. What effects are new media outlets having in sub-Saharan Africa? Amadou?
Well, I don't know who asked that question. To me, the role of Twitter and Facebook is still not clear because there's a lot of debate around it. But let me just say one word. Recently, maybe some of you have followed the Kony 2012, saga online. Now, that's about, a situation on the continent, and it really degenerated in this huge controversy online, really. I believe that, new media is still making its first steps on the continent, including actually in North Africa, including in Egypt, including in Tunisia, etc. Actually, if you do an analysis, it's less than 10% of the people really who've been using that. It's actually traditional media which amplified what was happening, on social media. So what's going to happen in Africa more and more, and that's, part of the programs we work on at the African Media Initiative, is to help traditional news organizations move towards what we call technological adaptation, so that they can not actually scrap and throw away their traditional models, but at least associate them with new forms of media emerging. And we just launched actually about 3 months ago $1 million fund, which we call the African News Innovation Challenge, which is actually just a way to encourage traditional media organizations to move into this space. So I think it's coming more and more in Africa, but in no way or means does it mean that the traditional models are going to be thrown by the window.
And another question from the audience. We have a gentleman in this direction. We'll get a microphone to you directly. If you would stand and tell us who you are and ask your question.
Sure. Jonathan Halpern with the Marcus Foundation. And I'm not sure who this is directed to, so I'll rely on your good counsel to guide it. But I'm sort of pondering that clearly we have a sense of the power of new media. We're not quite sure, I think, how it's going to play out or what its impact's going to be. But if you could reflect a little bit on these three pieces, which are information, which there's a ton of now flowing in video and other ways, but information doesn't necessarily add up to knowledge, just if you pile up information. And then after knowledge, maybe there's action as a third category. Reflections on how those relate, how they connect, and how new media affects those relationships?
It's a large challenge. Tom, I'll let you begin.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's one that we've been grappling with almost every day in how we present our material these days, because our traditional way of working is to go into the field and collect testimony of victims or eyewitnesses to abuses, and then put that together in a report or a press release and put it out. But at the moment, what we're seeing in Syria, for example, at the moment is, first of all, we can't actually get into the country. We were there for a few weeks in the early months of the conflict, but it's too dangerous at the moment. And we've seen journalists killed there recently. So we can't get into the country, so we're using often social media to get information out, whether it's Skype or Skype is actually the most secure way of communicating, but also through other means. But then at the same time, we're getting all this incredible footage of atrocities taking place. A lot of that is just out there on YouTube and elsewhere. For us, it's incredibly important to corroborate it, to make it as sure as possible that it is what it says it is. And so we've developed relationships with some of these citizen journalists within Syria who are producing this stuff. And they're often the ones who we're talking to and getting, the eyewitness accounts. And so we're able to verify, and because, we've had now a sort of fairly long-standing relationship with them, there's a sort of relationship of trust, and we kind of feel that we're comfortable with using their material and sort of certifying it, in a sense, by using it ourselves and putting the Human Rights Watch brand on it. And this is something that we're kind of pioneering. It makes our material obviously much more marketable, if you like, to the traditional media, because if we go to CNN or the BBC with just a sort of dry press release with no pictures, that's one thing. They might be interested in the information, but if we go with raw footage, whether it's video or still, that's much more attractive to them as television broadcasters. So we're finding that we're getting a lot more coverage, which is obviously good for our aims in terms of actually sort of drawing attention to the abuses that we are reporting on. So, I mean, that just answers a little bit of your question in a sort of anecdotal way, the sort of how we in our day-to-day work on Syria are trying to use some of the material that's out there to filter it, to give it a stamp of, to certify it, if you like, to say, yes, this is something that we believe to be true, accurate, it is what it says it is. Because, obviously this stuff is quite easy to forge, and we have to be careful about that. And, we're using that model now increasingly in different parts of the world, and we're trying to make sure that there is a multimedia component to almost every piece of, every product that we put out, particularly our longer reports.
From a YouTube perspective, and incredibly thankful to organizations like Human Rights Watch, which has a YouTube presence, I would also add to that, just trust the young. And so what I mean by that, in April 2009, I had the chance to go to Baghdad. I visited with a small group of technology executives as part of Secretary Clinton's 21st century statecraft. And during my meetings, we got to spend time with elected officials, appointed officials, private sector, NGOs. But for me, the most interesting were the student groups, the university students, all of whom very familiar with the tools that we've talked about up here, as both producers and consumers of information. And it's my experience that teenagers, especially teenage girls, will tell you exactly what they think. And so I asked the 17-year-old, well, how do you use YouTube? What do you think of YouTube as being? And she said two things. The first is, I get to see what the world cares about. Before, media was very local and regional, and that there was something really humane about understanding what a 17-year-old in Tokyo or a 17-year-old in San Francisco cares about. She felt much more connected to the world and to youth. The second, though, to the point of this question was, she said, I use it to come up with my own version of the truth. That before, if something happened locally, I would either hear rumors or I would see one official point of view, but I never quite got the sense of what actually happened. And now, because there are usually camera phones there, I can see multiple on-the-ground video. I can see different segments of news coverage uploaded from all across the world. And because anybody can contribute a video, I can hear other people's points of view. That what I do is I'm able to come up with my own version of the truth. And it seems to me that when you talk about getting from information to knowledge, that skill, building that, is an incredibly important 21st century ability that in the best case scenario, I think platforms like YouTube can help accelerate. But it doesn't happen right away. I sort of feel like, replace internet for printing press, and we could have been having some aspects of this conversation hundreds of years ago. That when these new forms come out, all of a sudden the tools of creation mean that you have an abundance of information and you start to wrestle with exactly what does that mean.
Yes, we have a question here. I was just reflecting as you said that you could say much of what's being said now about the social media, about some of the original letters of correspondence and the singular publishing presses of the 1760s, 1750s, even 1770s that led to the American Revolution, on a much smaller scale of readership, of course, but with an enormous impact being carried out by word of mouth and so on. If they had had electronics then, who knows what would have happened to the Crown of England. But much sooner, I suspect. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Lisa Hilton. I'm a jazz pianist and a composer. I believe in untethered journalism, but I do use YouTube and I post music videos. But I have noticed that as YouTube has grown, it's untethered in terms of the sexual exploitation of videos that seemingly there's more and more now. And I don't know where YouTube stands on that, but I think that you're asking the philanthropy, everyone in philanthropy to use YouTube more, but there seems to be an inundation of that kind of thing going on. So I don't know what your policy is on that.
Sure. So YouTube has always had a very clear policy with regards to any pornography, and that's it doesn't have a home on YouTube. And we have pretty sophisticated systems, both technically as well as our community flagging, as well as 24/7 human reviewers for content that's been flagged by the community. So I'm sorry you've had that experience. My experience has actually been that YouTube over time, just as a volume of video about a diverse topics coming in, as well as the evolution of these systems, has gotten pretty reliable in terms of if you come on the site and you're looking for educational information, you're going to find educational information. You're not going to get something about how to open a beer bottle with your bikini top. But I think overall, I sort of look at these things as platforms, and people sometimes say, well, I don't know whether I should be on that platform or not. And I say, well, you already are. And people say, well, what do you mean? I don't have an official channel. I say, well, we're the second largest search engine. We've got 850 million people worldwide, and we've got 60 hours of video being uploaded every minute. People are talking about you. They're talking about your cause. They're talking about your issues. And the best way to be a part of that is often to engage. And so that's what we try to figure out. We try to figure out what are the best tools that you can engage. And then within your community, how can you moderate that engagement? So for example, at the very tactical level, you can leave comments on or off on your video. You can allow people to upload video responses, or you can shut that feature off. So ultimately, when somebody gives us a piece of content, we do want them to feel like that is safe, that is theirs, and that they can create a presence that's just as much an extension of their website or their donor brochure. It just happens to be video-based and live within our community.
I'm going to try to get a couple of more questions in. Gentleman over here to my left.
John Harvey with the Council on Foundations. There was an interesting piece in the Times yesterday sort of equating news today, particularly as it relates to social media, as fireworks, where it's just big, it's boom, and then it's gone. And so we're inundated with stories. Coney 2012 is a good one. The current video on now is only getting about 16,000 hits a day, which is relatively small for where they were before. Anyway, just any thoughts on that with all of this news? Are we, I don't know, do we need more depth actually in understanding these issues? And do these media allow that? And if they don't, how do we make sure that isn't lost in our interest for more and good and better information?
I'm going to leave that up to any of the three of you who'd like to tackle it. I do think we have always had the phenomenon of every day's newspaper more or less seems to have forgotten the previous days or the previous weeks or the previous months. And the sense that a story that is the sensation of one particular day does not seem to have legs unless somehow or another we give them to that story. That has largely been inundated by just the sheer volume of material, as the earlier questioner was saying, that there seems to be no ability for anything to have any staying power because there is such a new flow of information each day. But that's why I suspect the panelists would be interested in talking about the challenge is to everyone involved in social media, independent media, the newest, the latest media, to look for structure, to look for ways that, whether by context and curation or by whatever means we can find using the skills that were developed over generations of professional journalism, to put some structure to all of this information, to find some way to make it of a more accessible value over a period of time, and to give it some cumulative merit as well.
I mean, I think indeed, the fact that it's not, a day to another, but like from 1 second to another, I mean, like news and information coming in like non-stop actually poses a huge challenge. And, it poses a challenge to society at large, but it also poses a serious one to the media community, in a sense that, almost everybody now produces news and information and distributes it, and can and has actually the means of distributing it widely. So I think it is, and I don't like the word regulation at all. I don't like that word. But we've been working on something which we call the leadership and guiding principles for media owners and operators, like for media owners and managers. And this is like a new program which we don't have anywhere else in the world. Usually journalists have code of conduct, codes of ethics, but not the managers and the owners. So because of this huge influx of everybody having a voice, which is a great thing, news organizations too tend to be competing in that space, and they're there every minute. So what it means is, of course, they leave aside all the traditional good, rules of journalism, which actually exposes them a little bit more. So we're championing this compact, as we call it, which is guiding principles for media owners and operators, so that they can have a sort of framework within which they can encourage, good journalism practice within these new media. Now, I'm not naive at all. I know it will continue to be that, and it would be, as long as we will all have the means to communicate, and we will have that more and more, everybody would keep having a voice, and media would just be following that trend too, unfortunately. But it shouldn't be done to the detriment of good, thoughtful news stories, feature news stories, which can, at the end of the day, play the critical role media has to play in society, which is being really, the role Thomas Jefferson was talking about, in 1787, as being basically the watchdog of our societies.
Yes, I think we would all like to see that survive, that particular dimension. Tom?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it goes also to what I was saying earlier about the economics of journalism. That many of the big news organizations that used to have bureaus all over the world, now they don't. And so instead what they do is they have a small cadre of foreign correspondents who they send in to sort of cover emergencies. So they're not really experts. They're more kind of people who are good at covering crises, and they just go from one to another. They don't have that sort of solid expertise. And I don't want to sort of blow Human Rights Watch's trumpet too much, but we have about 75 researchers working all over the world who are there when the media scrum has sort of left, continuing to do the solid research that needs to be done. So in Libya at the moment, we've got our researcher who's doing the work on Libya long after most of the journalists have left. And I think it's, to be fair to the new media, if you look at, and the internet is also a place where you can go for great depth, great analysis if you've got the time. And I think this is the problem, is that we don't have the time because we're so busy kind of processing all the information that is coming in. But it is there if you want to find it. And it's certainly there on hrw.org.
There was a lady with a question at the first table here.
Dale Hill, American Red Cross. Actually, you've touched on this issue, but maybe to take it a little further. We talked earlier about public-private partnership in other fields, and I wonder if the traditional business model of a competitive news business, you see it changing. Now, you've touched on it, the recent discussion has touched on it. Could it evolve into more of a partnership model with peer review, or a model where the various types of structures you represent, you've got public radio, you've got an association, you've got a private company, you've got a nonprofit, are cooperating more in pursuit of truth?
Well, my experience at All Africa, I co-founder of allafrica.com. Many of you, I'm sure, working on Africa would know that platform. We've been doing that for 12 years now. And indeed, it has huge value. It's very helpful. And it has to be championed more and more. Now, there's a fundamental problem, which is the reality is most news organizations tend to work on, what sells. And what sells is mostly scandals. Development stories, they won't just do it because it doesn't sell. Talking about the, corruption stuff as a headline, would sell much more than talking about, reducing maternal, issues. Whether it is like, children dying of diarrhea or others. I'm totally, sorry for that, but that's just a reality. Now, what it means is that there is a role, maybe, and Gates Foundation have started doing that kind of work in Africa, partnering with a group of, good, you see, quote unquote, good news organizations, so that, those issues which are affecting the daily lives of the populations can be brought up, to the surface. And there are ways of doing it. It's not easy to do because, all these guys are also competing between each other. But, there are some good ways of doing it. And it has results, good results.
Hunter, do you see a hybridized YouTube in the future where there are some of these different characteristics, some of the different characteristics of the organizations represented in this room?
So I think there's definitely aspects we've seen already, and most of that has been some of the larger news organizations sourcing video from individual content creators. Usually it's the, does anyone have video that you think is notable that we should see? And it often corresponds to some sort of crisis where the people on the ground or the people pulling out their smartphones or their cameras even before reporters get there. And that's fantastic. It certainly, I think, spread the breadth of content available to news organizations in a time where their budgets, their ability to go get that unique material in a timely manner is being hindered. But what I think is even more interesting is the opportunity for individual voices or groups of causes to get together and think of themselves actually not just as content creators, but content curators that are owning an issue. And what I mean by that is, let's say, let's talk about environment. Right now, as best as I know, I can go to my Comcast or Time Warner cable, and there's no 24/7 channel that's running about the environment. On YouTube, there's many. And those are started by commercial enterprises. Those are started by individuals. What I'm really hoping to see are more and more of the cause-based organizations or folks with education and action in mind, coming and saying, well, we're not just limited on YouTube by the content we can create. All this other content's coming in. We can add context to it. We can build playlists of other videos. When that video gets uploaded without sufficient context, showing an environmental issue, the person who points their camera at the ground at the fracking site and says, I don't know what this is, there's an opportunity for organizations to play that hub. So to think of themselves not just as this is telling our story, but that we have knowledge, we have authenticity, and we have authority around a topic area in general. And how do we start thinking about that, whether it's working with other agencies, whether it's working with your community, or whether it's working in concert with private sector? I really do think we're going to see more and more NGOs, foundations that look like media companies. We might need cool sunglasses and more hair products, but I think it's a great opportunity because YouTube essentially says, here's some worldwide spectrum. Here's a channel on the global, in the global living room. What do you want to do with it?
Indeed. The concept of untethering in journalism or in media in general is somewhat unsettling. I think most all of us have come to be somewhat comfortable with the media that we know and the origins of those media, and all of that is on its way into total transformation, if not extinction. So as we go forward, I think that some of the things that each of you have given us to think about in this panel, and I want to thank you all, Tom, Amadou, Hunter, given us a great deal of food for thought. And I do have a couple of announcements to make before you all take off. I want to remind you that the 4 o'clock session, the plenary session this afternoon, is going to feature former Prime Minister Tony Blair. And as a result, we encourage you all to arrive before 4 o'clock to take your places in good order, and also to bring with you a photo ID. So please do have a photo ID with you as you arrive for the 4 o'clock session, and do come early. As you can tell, it's going to take a little longer to come into the session because of the identification issue. Let me also mention that there is not a break at this time in the program. You are all to proceed directly to your 2 o'clock group sessions, which will be beginning in just 10 minutes or so. And then you will get a break at 3:15 in advance of the 4 o'clock session. Thank you all very much for being with us.